Today's daf is daf Yud Zayin, and we're up to Tvul Yom, which is the second line towards the end of that line. And the Mishnah says that a Tvul Yom who does his avoda is mechal the avoda. The avoda is disqualified. And the Gemara is going to ask me, Nolan, where do we know this from? What is the source in the Torah that the avoda of a Tvul Yom is disqualified? Let's just mention that a Tvul Yom, as opposed to a Zav, only saw one re'iyah, and he goes to the mikveh, but he needs what's called harev shemesh. Now, he only becomes tar after nightfall. So on the one hand, he did undergo part of the process of tara, and he went into the mikveh, but on the other hand, he has to wait a certain amount of time until after the sun sets. The Sanya we learned in the Brayso of Simoy Omer, Remez l'Tvul Yom she'im avad chilel minayin. Now, the word remez here is a little bit confusing because usually we say a remez is what's called an asmachta derabanan. Here we're not dealing with a din derabanan at all. We're dealing mamish with a din dorais. It has to be so because what we're saying is the avodah is psula. When you say the avodah is psula, that means that it has to be replaced by another carbon, and that can't be midrabanan because if on a doraisa level his avoda is kshera, and therefore there's no need for a replacement. The replacement now becomes what's called chulin lazar, which is a very severe isa. And the Ramban points out that throughout Shas, you'll see very often that the word remez is not to be identified with the word asmachta, and it really could refer to a doraisa, but sometimes it's Torah Shebal Peh, and therefore the Torah Shebal Peh wants to find some sort of an allusion to that din on a Torah level within the Torah. I know, for example, I wrote an entire piece of work on the Isa Yichud, and there also the Gemara says in Avodah Zarah and elsewhere, Remez l'Isa Yichud and Torah Minayin, and yet there are shitos that in certain circumstances Yichud is an Isa Doraisa. In any event, Tvul Yom is Machal is Avoda. Talmud Longer, we derive it from. Now, this pasuk that we're about to learn is in Vayikra Chaf Aleph, and it deals with the Iser of a Kohen to become Tomei. A Kohen is not allowed to be Mitami himself, he has to remain in a state of purity. And right before this, we'll have to see exactly what Isurim come before this. For example, there's an Isur called karcha. Karcha means you're not allowed to make bald spots on your head. And then there's an Isur of cutting your beard, with a razor. And all those lavim come before this. But this one, according to the Brayso, this pasuk is referring to a tameh, and specifically to the fact that a Kohen is not allowed to become tameh. Now, it's very strange because this pasuk is not really the source for the Isur that enjoins a Kohen from contracting tumah. But we learned that from another pasuk, which is later on in Parsha, in Perek Chav Beis in Vayikra. So the Bryce asks him, right? In Eno Inyan Litome Dinofik Mivi Nazru, right? The Torah says in that next chapter over there, Vayikra Chav Beis, it says, Daber Bnei Yisrael, El Aron Vel Banavi Nazru Mikodshe Bnei Yisrael V'Yechaluk Shem Kodshi. So therefore, we have what's called an Eno Inyan. If the Torah repeats itself, then we have to use the repetition for some derivation. Is Tneu Inyan L'Tvul Yom. We'll use it to derive the conclusion that although Tvul Yom has already passed a major chunk of the process that is mitayr him to purify himself from his tumah, so he's not exactly like a full-fledged tameh, and he only has to wait time. That's all that's lacking over here. Then the Torah is marbet to teach me that even he is under v'lo yechalu, meaning that he should not do the avoda, which if he does, that would be mechal his avoda. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, right there in the psukim before kedoshim you is right? The two prohibitions against creating a bald spot on your head or, cutting your beard in 5 different corners with a razor. So why don't we assume that if a Kohen violated those lavim, maybe the Torah is being marred, but them that such a Kohen is mechalel his avoda, which really is a remarkable havamina to say that this Isser, which applies to both Kohanim and to Zarim, should now, in the case of a Kohen, change his personal status, and it generates a psul gavra. Again, all this is just a havamina, and his avoda is avoda psul because he violated these lavim. I mean, we don't find that if a Kohen violates a lav, then ipso facto his avoda is psula. So the Gemara therefore argues that since this pasuk of lo yechalalu appears right after these two lavim, then the meaning of the pasuk of lo yechalalu should be related to those lavim rather than tful yom, which is not even in the parsha at all. So now the Gemara is going to try to convince us that this pasuk lo yechalu must be referring to a tful yom. Now, why is that so? Tful yom diim avad b'misa minolan. If we could derive the conclusion that the violation of avoda on the part of a Kohen Posel, in this case of a tful yom, is so severe that that violation generates a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim, and we're going to derive that in a minute from a gzeirah from Truma, then it's logical to assume that the person who's being described by the Torah as lo yechalalu, that he's being mechalel the avoda, is that same person who, if he goes and he does the avoda, he violates a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim. How do we know that it's tful yom who violates the Isser of avoda is chayav misa b'dei shamayim? The gomer chilul chil mitruma. Right, the word chilul appears in 2 parshas. Right here we said lo yechalalu, and also in the parsha of Truma, which is also in Vayikra Chav Beis, it says V'shomers mishmarti v'lo yisu olav chet u'mosubo ki yechalaluhu. So that gives me a gzeira shava equating a chilul of the avoda from the chilul of Truma. So that since a tful yom, as we derive it from this gzeira shava, if he eats Truma, he is really profaning the Truma, and certainly by violating the Isa Truma, he incurs a chiyuv misa. Is therefore through this gzeira shava, we're going to derive that even a tful yom is going to be chayav, and if he's chayav, then it makes sense that lo yechalu means that he will desecrate his avodah, disqualify his avodah. The pasuk b'truma machil avoda. Right, if he is excluded from truma, and it's tful yom is not allowed to eat truma, that's the subject, by the way, of the first Mishnah in Shas at the beginning of Brachos, that maybe Saikar Nishma B'Arvis, that's only after tful yom is allowed to eat truma, which means he has harif shemesh, but until harif shemesh, he's not allowed to eat truma. So the Gemara is assuming that Posel B'Truma, that if he is excluded from eating Truma, then likewise Mechil Avoda, if he goes and he does Avoda in Migdash, he'll be Mechal Avoda. However, Lo Posel B'Truma, let's say, for example, the Kohen violated the Isser of Karachas and he created a bald spot on his head, or he violated the Isser of Hashchosas Piasa Zokan, then he still is allowed to eat Truma. He's not excluded from Truma, and therefore he would not be excluded from the Avodah. So again, Tvul Yom, as far as finding some sort of a source in the Torah for the fact that he will be Machalel, we find it by Truma and Gzeir Shav from Truma to Chil Havodah. And what was the pasuk in Chil Havodah? Lo yichalu Hashem Elokeichem, etc. Okay. So now we're up to Omar Rabbah with a little bit of an introduction. We now know that a Tvul Yom is Machal his Avodah. Now, the Torah teaches us in 3 categories of Tumah that if the Kohen is Tameh in either A, B, or C, and he goes and he does the Avodah, he's Machal his Avodah. And Rabbah is going to try to explain why I need all 3. So what are the 3 cases? Number 1, we have a full-fledged Tameh, like, for example, he came in contact with a sheretz or a dead body. Number 2, we have a Tvul Yom. And number 3, we have the case of Mechusa Kapara. So let's just read Rabbah, and then we'll try to spend a few minutes explaining what a Mechusa Kapara is, because that really is the subject. The comparison between Tvul Yom and Mechusa Kapara is the subject of today's daf. Omar Rabbah, Lamali de Kasa Rahmana Tameh, meaning why did the Torah have to teach me that the avoda of a Tameh is mechuleles, it's invalid. Tvul Yom, and the Torah is going to teach me Tvul Yom, as we saw in the limud from Lo Yechalu, and Mechusa Kapar. Now we're going to try to derive the halacha that a Mechusa Kapara apostles his avoda in a few minutes, but Rabbah's question is, why do I need all 3? And now Rabbah is going to answer his question with the word srichi, that we cannot derive one from the other. We need the Torah to teach me all 3 categories of Tameh. Now, the structure or the logic of the Gemara is that we're going to discover in each one of the cases of these 3 categories, there's a chumrah. For example, Dikos Rahmana Tameh, and if the Torah had only taught me that a Tameh who does the avodah, he came in contact with a dead body, and his avodah is psula, is I would say shekain mitame. So again, here we're getting a little bit into the laws of taros, and the question is transmission of tumah. And a full-fledged tameh, let's say, for example, a man comes in contact with a corpse. The corpse is on avia vos hatuma, and the person who came in contact with the corpse now is an av hatuma, and he's mitame od v'kelim, and ochlin umashkin, straight across the board. Therefore, if we compare, for example, tameh, who came in contact with a corpse, to the other 2 categories that the Mishnah establishes their avodas psula, namely a Tvul Yom and a Mechusa Kapara, none of those will convey tumah to others. So let's say, for example, a Tvul Yom might have the status of a sheni l'tumah, and therefore if he touches kodshim, he could pasal kodshim and make it into a shlishi, but not chulin. And in the case of Mechusa Kapara, I don't think he's metabe anything. Okay, fine. So therefore, since Tame, if the Torah had only told me Tame is Machalas Avoda, is the most chamur, that it's Mitame, I need the Torah to tell me Tful Yom and Mechusa Kapara. Now let's go through them. Why? Let's say the Torah had just mentioned Tful Yom. Is the Gemara says Mechusa Kapara lost Minesh came possible with Truma. But Tful Yom, as we said before, is enjoined from eating Truma. A Mechusa Kapara, someone who underwent Tvila and he had Hariv Shemesh. He's only missing his Kapara, meaning in 4 cases, that's called Zav, Zov, Mitzorah, and Yoledis. The Tame, even after having undergone all the stages of purification, including Saynikiyim, including Tvila B'mikvah, including Hariv Shemesh, nevertheless needs to bring on the very next morning, the 8th day, a karma. That's called Mechusa Kapara. The word Kapara means karma. So where do we find a chumrah in Tful Yom that we don't find in Mechusa Kapara? Both of them are in the throes of and the progress of the purification process, and none of them can be mitame anyone else or anything else. But Tful Yom has a chumrah that doesn't apply to Mechusa Kapara, namely he's possible from Truma. And since there's halacha psul, Tful Yom and Truma, that makes Tful Yom more chamer than Mechusa Kapara, which is he's allowed to eat Truma. And therefore, had I only had Tful Yom, I would not be able to derive the conclusion that even a Mechusa Kapara, if he went ahead and did the avoda, he would passel, he'd be machal the avoda. Now we go the other way around. Let's say the Torah had told me Mechusa Kapara. Now Mechusa Kapara, vis-a-vis Tvul Yom, is more kal. Because as we said before, Mechusa Kapara is not excluded from eating Truma, whereas a Tvul Yom is excluded from eating Truma. So what chumrah could we find in Mechusa Kapara which would block the possibility of deriving Chil Avoda in Tvul Yom, because Tvul Yom is Lakula vis-a-vis Mechusa Kapara. In other words, if you were asking where's the chumrah in Tvul Yom, if you want to derive Chil Avoda to Mechusa Kapara, the answer is because Tvul Yom is possible with Truma. But now we're looking for a chumrah in Mechusa Kapara, and the Gemara says the following: Tvul Yom, I could not derive Tvul Yom from Mechusa Kapara. Shekain Mechusa Maisa. We should be more machmir in the case of a Mechusa Kapara because he hasn't done what he has to do. He has yet to bring his carbon. That's called the Lashon Hashas Mechusa Maisa. He's missing an action. Tful Yom is not missing an action. He doesn't have to do anything. He already went to Mikveh. We just have to look at the clock and wait till nightfall. Wait till Kol Nidre. So the Gemara is, okay, if I only had one of the 3, I could not derive the others because there's always a chumrah in any single one of those 3 categories. But Teisei Chanamitarti, why couldn't the Torah have left out one of the 3, and that one could be derived from a tzad hashava from the other 2? So the Gemara asks, which one do you want to leave out of A, B, and C so that A plus B could teach C? Why don't we just leave out Mechusa Kapara? Unless you can tell me that Mechusa Kapara is more kal than the other ones, and that's exactly what the Gemara says. Malahanach shekain pos psulim l'truma. Well, a person who touches a mess, full-fledged tameh, is excluded from truma. And likewise, we said that a Tvul Yom is excluded from truma. So Tvul Yom and tameh both have a chumrah that doesn't apply to Mechusa Kapara because Mechusa Kapara is allowed to eat truma. Ella, but rather l'lichta rachmana Tvul Yom. And now we're going to say that Tvul Yom is is more chamur. Let's derive from the other two. To my parchas, what's going to be a pircha? Malahanach shekei mechusar ma'isa. Right, they're more chamur because they need a ma'isa. Whether it be a tomei who has to go to the mikveh, whether it be a mechus kapara who has to bring his karban. And therefore, in light of the fact that the Torah was machmir in these two cases because of mechus ma'isa, I cannot derive tul yom who's not mechus ma'isa. But the answer is self klisha leitum asam. Okay, now let's see if we can crack this nut called klisha la tum asam. The Gemara is saying the following. While on the one hand, it's true that Mechusar Kapara has to do a mice of bringing his Kapara, whereas a Tvul Yom does not. He just waits it out. Nevertheless, in the final analysis, a Mechusar Kapara is a less Chamur Tuma than Tvul Yom. And therefore, if Tvul Yom is more Chamur, then through a Kal V'chomer, again, I need a tzad shava because Tomei. I could certainly derive that a Tvul Yom is Mechal Avoda. Now, what's the logic in the Gemara's question to lead the conclusion that Mechusar Kapar is more Kal? I think the Gemara now is analyzing Tumah. I mean, imagine if you were, what's it called in the, if you go to, the a fair, they have this thing where you have to shoot up the liquid has to go all the way to the top, you hit it with a hammer and stuff like that. You have a thermometer of some sort and you want to gauge Tumah, then Mechusar Kapara is 90% of the way to Tara. Again, as we said before, he passed his Zayin Akir. He already went to the mikveh. And he had Hariv Shemesh. I mean, Mamash, he's tar. Ella, what the Torah says, he's got to bring a kapara. So tomorrow he'll bring his korban. But in the meantime, shall we say that his tumah is a more chomer, or a deeper, more profound tumah, or a weaker tumah? It's certainly a weaker tumah. Tvul Yom is still within the time period of tumah, whereas Mechusar Kapar is outside the time period of tumah. And the Gemara says that we have to introduce another statement of Rabbah,